Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history, heritage and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was James Graham, who has a postgraduate in Archives and Records Management, and he is also part of a Civil War Re-enactment Society and an animator for his history channel, JammyHistory, which is on Instagram. James spoke to me about the English Civil War, and I hope you enjoy. So what is it about this battle that you wanted to talk about? Why is it important?
So the battle is the Battle of Rowton Heath, or so known as the Battle of Rowton Moor, depending on who you talk to, because people always argue over which word for hill is the right one to use when talking about it. So either's fine. But it's one of those battles of the First British Civil War that is not as well known. Usually when people talk about the ones they know, they'll talk about the Battle of Edge Hill or the Battle of Naseby. And this is a very small battle that takes place just outside the city of Chester in northwest England. And it's one where on paper it doesn't have like the grandiose of like Naseby or Marston Moor, but it did mark a very important turning point, because basically it was the battle that kicked Charles down further than I think he needed to be, well, he wanted to be at that point. It was the thing he thought was going to go really well for him, and he was going to bounce back after Naseby, and he basically just got kicked back down. And it's one of those battles that very much led to the end of the Civil War, to King Charles surrendering, and it also marks a turning point for how the Royalist Army could even operate. Because it would impact the siege of Chester that was ongoing, and losing Chester was seen as a very significant thing for the Royalists, because at the time Chester was the main road into North Wales. So if Chester fell, then the parliamentarians can now launch a large-scale campaign into North Wales, which was a pro-royalist area, and it would take away, it means that one of the safest places to be a royalist was now suddenly a very unsafe place to be a royalist, as you'd have the parliamentarians marching through. It also meant that he was also losing his final port city, because at this point in time, the River Dee outside Chester has not yet silted, so it's still a very big port city. Liverpool's not yet replaced it in that regard, and King Charles had been using it to ferry troops over and ferry supplies over from his supporters in Ireland. And so losing Chester would then cut off that access. So in just like one small day with one engagement, he not only fails to protect the city of Chester, but he then loses two vital parts of his entire war effort. And so that's why it's a very big deal for him. And after that, he sort of sits there and goes, we can bounce back from this, right? Still, right, guys? And he looks around and there's no one there now for him. So it was very much the turning point for the Royalist will to continue the war.
Yeah, so was this, I'm assuming this is nearing the end of the war itself, because I know that Charles started running out of funds and started getting money from his other half, and then there's actually a lot of forged coins that were coming out at that time as well to try and pay for the soldiers, if they got paid at all.
Well, yeah, that's it. At this time, the Royalists were in dire straits. I mean, throughout the war, Charles has sort of been having to rely on a lot of external help to help him throughout the war. His wife had been going around Europe since 1642, since the very beginning of the war, going, my husband's a monarch, and his parliament wants to like overthrow him, or at least like curb the powers of the monarchy. And all of you monarchs should be really on board with stopping that happening. So she was always out collecting weapons, collecting supplies, collecting money, and having it shipped over into England. And normally that would arrive through Yorkshire, was always their like main base for external support. And then when Yorkshire fell to the parliamentarians in 1644, they then sort of had to go the more roundabout way by sending things to Ireland or to Chester, or like to northwest England, which in this case would be Chester, because it was one of the few ports they had in England now at this point. And the Royalist Navy was not very existent at this point. It was ever since right at the beginning of the war, Parliament had the entire Navy under their grasp, save a couple ships, which the Royalists had. And so it meant that in anything that got shipped over had to go through the shortest distance they could possibly get it, so avoid it getting cut off. And to do that from Ireland, that's to sail it from Dublin to Chester as like your nearest English port where you could safely land them for it. But yeah, by this point, when the Battle of Rowton Heath takes place, Charles has just lost his main army, his Pride army, at the Battle of Naseby, where he comes up against this thing called the New Model Army for the first time, which had revolutionary ideas like paying your soldiers on time. And yeah, I know, right? Everyone was shocked by it. Paying your soldiers on time. They had this. They were trying to introduce this thing called meritocracy in their army as well. Charles didn't get it. He thought it was a bit weird. But they won the Battle of Naseby, and that was Charles's main field army gone. He lost that. And so at this point, he's trying to scrounge together forces. He's trying to scrounge together finances, which he didn't have a lot of either of them. He had a couple of garrisons across Wales that he was trying to strip together to create a new piecemeal army. He had the garrison in Chester that he was hoping that he could take out of the city and add it into his new army and try and rebuild it from the ground up so that he could have at least something to tackle the new model army with. Or at least put the threat that he would continue the war and try and find other ways to come around it. But he was very much strapped for cash. I was reading about the Siege of Chester a bit more in detail recently, and they were talking about the dire financial straits that they were having because they were having to pay their soldiers during the siege. And the military governor at the time, Lord Byron, basically said, "Oh, it's fine. We're paying them 2p a day." 2p and a loaf of bread and they should be all happy. And that's how strapped they were for cash for it. And that was very much a 2p a day, but only if we get it, really. So for a lot of the forces, it was just no money, no real supplies. And they were trying, it was basically desperation to try and build something back.
It's amazing that they were actually still with them by the end of it. It was the fact that they don't have any money. They've probably lost their friends in the battles and things like that. And yet this guy that you supposedly support is not paying you. It's like, how do you keep going in those situations?
The main reasons to keep going this time, like Chester had been besieged since December 1644 by this point, in a very loose blockade. So they were still able to get supplies in. So it wasn't like a complete siege where they were starving for an entire year. But it meant that they were at least cut off in a lot of places. They had dwindling supplies, but they still had some supplies. So they could keep themselves going in terms of food, in terms of the small amounts of money that would come in. But the main thing that would keep these garrisons going was the idea that if you surrender now to Parliament, now that they know they're winning, you're not going to get the best deals out of this. And people would defend their towns, defend their cities, just not because they have strong loyalty to the king or because they, love not even they love their home kind of thing. It was just that they feared what was going to happen if they let the enemy in. If they open the gates to the enemy and let them come through, are they really going to be nice to you? Because a lot of them haven't been paid in a while either.
Yeah.
And they know that there might be some valuables in there that they could take. The Civil War was scattered with instances of armies coming through and ransacking things, whether that's the parliamentarians taking Winchester and blowing the cathedral windows off during the sack because they kind of felt like it. For it. It's great. They've just put a cannon next to it and just fired it through it, and it's so stupid. But you also have the royalists, Prince Rupert was notorious for it. There's so many pamphlets about him going around, and it was every time Prince Rupert goes to a town and takes it from Parliament, the town he doesn't leave the town unless it's smoking and completely ablaze because he lets his soldiers ransack it. So for a lot of these soldiers, it was a case of we keep fighting now just to protect what we have and make sure that they can't actually damage it. And Charles is he's a bit of an optimist. He still thinks he can turn this around. he still thinks if he gets an army together, if he reunites with, if he brings the Welsh garrisons together, if he rejoins with his Scottish allies, because at this point, the Marquis of Montrose, who's his one ally in Scotland, has done tremendously well and has managed to win enough victories to basically bring Scotland all under royalist control. So he hopes that he can get back up to Scotland and basically continue the war from up there, where he now has like a complete royalist country under his control, and he can keep it going there. But for the everyday soldier, a lot of them don't really want to do this anymore. They, you know, like you said, they're tired, they're poor, they haven't been paid in ages. And there's not much that's keeping them going. It's just a case of a lot of them are more being compelled to stay rather than actually willingly staying.
And I do find it interesting that you said that Wales was very royalist as well, especially as Wales have not really had the best of relationships in regards to the monarch overall. So I find it interesting that you said that Wales is part of, it was like Team Charles, yay!
It's always one of those things where a lot of the pro-royalist areas were probably the most surprising areas. Like Cornwall was very pro-royalist, despite the fact that they'd hate anything English really at this time for it. But they kind of went in with the mantra of the King of England's okay. We just hate the English Parliament more. So we'll fight them because we know they'll come to us if we don't go and fight them first.
Valid. I think that's valid. Yeah. So you yourself, you also do reenactment, Civil War reenactment. Which side are you on?
I am what would often be described as the dirty parliamentarian. Fighting fighting as a member of the Earl of Manchester's regiment within the See or Not lovely reenactment group, and we sort of portray the Earl of Manchester's force, who was in command of the Eastern Association before Parliament reorganises its military and creates the new model army. They had a lot of their MPs in charge of armies. They had a lot of the nobility in charge, and they organised them into what they called the associations. So the Earl of Manchester led the Eastern Association, and he had this this sort of junior cavalry officer in his cohort known as Oliver Cromwell, who he becomes a bit important later apparently. But at this time, he's just a cavalry officer. And the Earl of Manchester is the one who really takes the lead in a lot of the battles he fights. So at the Battle of Marston Moor, the winning flank for the parliamentarians was the left flank, which was the Earl of Manchester's flank. And Oliver Cromwell was there as like leading the cavalry as part of that battle. But by 1645, the leadership of the upper parliamentarians is called into question by these sort of junior officers who are also MPs, and they sit there and go, well, the problem is they're like, we keep losing battles. I don't think we should be. They have a battle. They had the second battle of Newbury at the end of mid 1644, and on paper it's a complete war in the park for Parliament. And it very much could have been the end of the war from their perspective, because they had the King's army, his wonderful Oxford army that's still intact at this point, has been surrounded by the Eastern Association, the Southern Association, and the Earl of Essex's army, which was the main parliamentarian force. And they basically surrounded it, and they spent the day fighting with the royalists like back to back, basically having to fight from all fronts. And the day ends in the draw, and the king is allowed to just walk out at the end of the day with his army. And exactly, and like Oliver Cromwell was just stood there like, you serious? We could have won that. The war could have been over. We could have had the king. We could have destroyed his main army. We could have been done. And so he goes to Parliament, and he basically throws a big hissy fit at them and says, all of you MPs are rubbish, and none of you have a right to command this army. And he has a big debate with the Earl of Manchester, because the Earl of Manchester he's often seen as being a bit of like a weak leader. He was very much, he was a good leader in terms of the military side of it. And what he kind of wanted was a bit of more moderate peace. where he was like, we have the king, like, we bring him to terms, we have a nice chat with him, and we bring the war to an end that way. And there's a great quote with it, which I guess explains his mentality, where he says that, like, if we fight 100 battles against the king and we win 99 of them, he will still be the king of England. But if he wins one against us, we're finished. We're done. We can't recover from it. So he was often described as being a bit of a defeatist. And so Cromwell argues that all these officers, these upper commanders, are just too timid. They're all defeatists. They aren't willing to go for the win, as he sort of described it. And so he gets what he called the self-denying ordinance passed in Parliament, which said that no MP could lead an army unless like they had like certain like exemptions, which Oliver Cromwell had to use because he was also an MP. But that gets passed, so the Earl of Manchester loses his command. So we portray the Earl of Manchester's force before he gets kicked out of his command, when he's still leading against the Royalist forces, and it's great fun traveling around. We get to go around the country, go to loads of these different places. Literally just this bank holiday weekend, I was at the Battle of Croppedy Bridge reenactment that they hosted, which was really good fun. We hosted it on the battle site itself. So at the beginning, we got to walk over the bridge and then onto the battlefield, which was really cool. And it was a good day. We had about 1,000 reenactors on the field, from what I gathered, with pikes, with muskets. We had cavalry, we had artillery, and it gives you a very good impression of what these battles are like. But of course, I don't go in with the knees-knocking sensation that a lot of the soldiers going through the actual battles had to experience.
Yeah, because you're not going to actually really get shot at. So when you do your reenactment, are you pretending to be someone, or are you just a soldier?
Depending on the event. So for most events where it's these big battles, I am just a soldier in the Parliamentarian Army, soldier from the Earl of Manchester's regiment, standing there in my red coat and my musket, firing away, all happy day. I don't need to have like a specific persona or anything like that. But we also do smaller events as well, smaller regimental events where we have our own camp set up and we can talk about certain things. So they're often a lot more like public engagement focused, talking to a lot more people. And so for some people at these, they love to have like their own personas. They have their own names. They go around like, I am this person, and they get to like be a bit more theatrical about it. But you can also say it's like, oh, I do this particular trade, and you can talk about the trade during the period. So I often talk about like what it is like being a soldier during the 17th century, the tools you would have to fight with, the conditions you'd be going through, and we get to talk about it from that kind of bit more of like a full-on experience.
And you're clearly very passionate. You won't be doing a reenactment and stuff like that. So what is it about the Civil War that got you interested in it to begin with?
I admittedly I got into reenactment before I was interested in the Civil War. It was the other way around, really. I had wanted to have a go at reenactment. I did watch a Battle of Rowton Moor reenactment that happened at Chester. I think it was in 2015. And I was stood there in the audience going, this is cool. I kind of want to have a go at this, have a go at this just for fun. And then once I became part of it and I was going to these places, we were doing these battles and I was doing those more like public orientated events with talking to people, I gradually became more and more immersed in the period and wanted to know more and more about it. And the more I learned about it, the more I stood there. I was like, why don't we talk about this more? It is really interesting about it, because it is an interesting time where it's such a, the country becomes very incredibly polarized and you have these political camps, but you also have a lot of people who are stood there going, we just want to be left alone. We don't want to be involved in this. It's the Civil War in Britain that doesn't get as much coverage as like the War of the Roses does, or even the Anarchy gets more coverage. But I think missing out on the actual British Civil Wars is a bit of a travesty, because there is so much to it. about it, and it's a war that affected basically everyone. Even if you weren't on the front lines or in, being forced to fight in an army, you were affected by that war, probably more than you might have been by the others.
Yeah, I must admit, because I did learn about the Civil War in school. I don't know if that's still something that kids are still learning, but it was a very quick sort of thing. Like, also, you have Charles I, you have Parliament, they fought, he lost, so he got his head lobbed off, and that's pretty much the long and short of what you end up learning.
Yeah, that's not changed. When I learned it in high school, and it was like, here are the causes of the Civil War, and we went through it, and then it was like, and now we talk about the trial of King Charles I, and I was always sat there like, didn't something happen in the middle that we've missed? And they just go, no, nothing happened. They fought like 2 battles, and that was it. About it, they were like the Battle of Edgehill and the Battle of Naseby, the only ones you need to remember. And they're like, and now look, the king's on trial. Let's talk about that bit instead. That's more interesting.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, so there's no other battles. Nothing happened. You know, Parliament just got annoyed and cut off his head. That's the long and short of it.
Oh yeah. They were just very annoyed the whole time. They spent every Parliament session waggling their fingers, going, "Oh, we're all annoyed at him."
Yeah, I also find it interesting as well that if you go onto Google and you type in Civil War, instantly, I mean, Google is an American company anyway, but I find it interesting that if you type in Civil War, it instantly just goes to American Civil War, and it's like, excuse me, we had a Civil War first.
It sometimes is difficult when you're trying to look up something, and it'll go like, and you even put in like English Civil War, and it goes, yes, so here's it in the American Civil War. I'm like, that's not what I wanted. I was like, please just show me the thing I wanted. It is, I guess I mean, obviously the American Civil War is a very big thing for America, so it makes sense that for a conflict that's so iconic for them, it would, I guess, overshadow what is probably perceived as a bit of a middling conflict in England. We don't talk about it as much as they do. It doesn't have the same kind of lingering effect on us today as it does for America, where it's still something you talk about as like a very relevant thing about it. But we only talk about it when things happen, and you go, the last time it was like when Parliament got prorogued by Boris Johnson, and it said the last time this happened was by King Charles I, and which led to the English Civil War, and everyone went, wait, what? So it's only like in specific examples does it ever really come up again.
But I think it's a very important story to talk about, because basically what our Parliament's like now is from that starting point is from that battle. There's a reason why they're in charge, and the fact that nobody really remembers that is a bit of a shame. But the interesting thing about it as well, I suppose, it wasn't as clean cut as it is with other things. So like, we did get rid of a monarchy, and then we were like, we still want a king, we just don't want him to have power, you know. We'll bring his son back. It's fine.
Even like at the beginning of the Civil War, Parliament were very unsure what they actually wanted from this, because a lot of people were convinced it was never actually going to happen. It's like it was like a bunch of saber rattling. There's a lot of like political posturing that goes on in the road up to it. About it, and then you get to like there are accounts of like the week before, and there are like militias forming outside of cities, and the governor goes to him, goes like, why are you even doing it? Like, it's not actually happening. He's like, this is just political posturing, it's just saber rattling, it's just, it's just the king and politicians having a go at each other. It's not actually going to happen. And even at the beginning of the Civil War, Parliament were like, are we fighting this? And they stood there at the Battle of Edgehill like, we are fighting this, right? It took them a while, I think, to realise it. And you learn it that you can see it a lot in how they even talk about the war during it. So at the beginning of the war, a lot of parliamentarian recruitment pamphlets said the phrase, fight for king and parliament. Which confused a lot of people, because the way they sort of viewed the conflict was that their problem was with King Charles, but their problem was mainly with his advisors. They sort of saw it as the king's bad, but it's not his fault. it's his royal advisors who are giving him bad advice, and we want them gone. And once they're gone, the king can listen to us more, and he'll be good. And he'll accept all our demands and our requests, and everything will be happy. I think it's what a lot of them wanted. But even by the latter stages of the war, you still had that mentality going through. So when we talk about Chester for it, after the Battle of Rowton Heath, the parliamentarian commander who was then reappointed because he was someone who was kicked out in the self-denying ordinance, and then he was reappointed to command the Cheshire forces after the Battle of Rowton Heath. So he's playing musical chairs with commands at this point for it. I think they sent him home, and then he went back. They sent him back out again, which was very confusing. But he kept sending letters into Chester asking for them to surrender. And he always included the phrase, surrender your city for the use of king and parliament. So even in the later stages of the war, when you have these more moderate politicians who are not allowed to lead the army, there was still very much this consensus that they were not actually going to get rid of the king at all. They just wanted to rein him in, get rid of some of his advisors, put some controls on, have it so that Parliament gets to say over a lot more things, and have it so that the king can't just close Parliament down whenever they're doing something he doesn't like, or whenever they're asking the king to do something, and he's going, no, not listening. You're closed. You're going away for 13 years or however long he wants to close them. And so even so, by then there's still a lot of people who go, yeah, but we're still going to have him. It's not until the Second Civil War happens that Parliament actually starts to come around to this notion that maybe we need to get rid of him, because what they learned in the gap between the First and Second British Civil War was that King Charles is not really willing to negotiate on this, that he's not going to be as accommodating as they wanted. And a lot of for a fair few of them, they sat there and went, oh, the problem was him all along, not his advisors. Because while they were negotiating with him and trying to bring a peace together with the king, now that he had surrendered himself to them, King Charles had been there, poking a stick at all the parliamentarian factions, going, come on, hate each other, break apart. And he gets the Scottish Covenanters, who had been the parliamentarian Scottish allies, he gets them to turn on Parliament and fight for the king, under the promise that he will protect their religious rights in Scotland, because he spends his entire time in captivity going, you don't really think Parliament's going to give you what you want out of this war, do you? I'm the King of England. I could make that happen for you. And so he gets the Scots detained to swap sides and fight the Second Civil War on his behalf. And so when they get defeated, Parliament has to go then back to the table and go, how do you negotiate with a man who has openly basically admitted that he will not negotiate with you, and that he would rather drag the country into a second civil war just to stop you guys winning?
Yeah, it's just madness. See, we don't learn about this in school.
It is a mad time.
Yeah, so I'm based in West Yorkshire, and I realised that there is actually parts of the Civil War that happened here in Yorkshire as well. So I think it's so I live near Darlington, which is near Leeds. So it's is it Everton Moor or something?
Okay.
And basically there was a battle there, and the person in charge of that was a gentleman called Fairfax.
Yes. I'm familiar with him. Can I ask if it's specifically, this is me getting specifics, is it Ferdinando Fairfax or is it Sir Thomas Fairfax?
I think it's Sir Thomas Fairfax and the Battle of Bradford and all that sort of
yes. Yes. So, I mean, Sir Thomas Fairfax is he's very much the undershadowed figure of the parliamentarian team. About this, I could talk, because I quite like Sir Thomas Fairfax. I could talk for ages about him. But I say, when people talk about how Cromwell wins the Civil War and how Cromwell is the man of the parliamentarian of the Civil War, at the time he is still a junior cavalry commander, and then he rises through the ranks to become the head of parliamentarian horse. But during that first Civil War, it actually is Sir Thomas Fairfax who becomes the prominent voice for the parliamentarians. He joins this because he joins the parliamentarian side because his dad was a lord and fought for the parliamentarian side, and he becomes a very experienced commander, and he leads part of the army at Marston Moor. He's one of the main parliamentarian figures in Yorkshire and across like the north of England. And when the self-denying ordinance is passed, Sir Thomas Fairfax is not kicked out because he's not an MP for it. And so when they're looking at the new model army that is now being created, they're doing a whole military reorganization. And so they go, right, we need to put the army under command of someone now that we've got rid of all our like upper leadership. So they look at like who's left for their commanders. And so they take Sir Thomas Fairfax and they put him as the head of the new model army. He becomes the commander-in-chief of the entire parliamentarian army then at that point as well. And Oliver Cromwell becomes his like cavalry officer subordinate for it. And the reason they pick Sir Thomas Fairfax is because he's very experienced at this point. He's been present for a lot of the big battles. He's proven to be very competent about it at like Marston Moor. He's very daring as well at the Battle of Marston Moor. When like his sort of the army gets broken and starts to run away, he does like a daring dash across the battlefield to the other side of the battlefield to tell the Earl of Manchester what's going on, because he doesn't know, and says, we're losing on that flank, you now need to do something on this flank, else we're going to lose the entire thing. And so he has to do this daring journey across the middle of the battlefield, which involves weaving through like units that are fleeing and the royalists that are pursuing about it. It's a very perilous journey. And so he's very much proven to be a good commander, and he's proven he's got the right aptitude. But there's another reason why he gets picked, and it's because everyone quite likes him about it. And popularity is quite a nice thing to have during this time. He has a good reputation. He has a very honourable reputation, which was a thing that Parliament liked. They said that's going to be good, and it was a thing that the Royalists all knew as well. And they said that this was really good for them because after the Battle of Naseby, with King Charles's main army broken and him fleeing up north towards like Cheshire to try and build together a hodgepodge force, so Thomas Fairfax and the New Modern Army can go around bit by bit to all the main the main royalist cities in the south of England and start to take them one by one. And what Sir Thomas Fairfax would do is he'd like plant his army up in front, he'd do a little siege, and then he would send in a very generous peace offer. And the royalists all knew that because he's a very honourable man, he's going to keep his word, and they will be protected if they take those terms. And so you find that a lot of royalist commanders will actually give in more if they know the person that they're up against is a very nice person and someone that you could trust. A good example is the Siege of Bristol, where it's held by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, King Charles's nephew. He's been one of the most daring commanders of the Civil War at this point. He's one of the biggest fighters. He's also one of the most hated men in the Royalist Army.
Oh, wow.
Because of his reputation for sacking cities, sacking towns. And he tries to hold out Bristol. And then after a short siege, Sir Thomas Fairfax says, in exchange for giving me Bristol, you and your entire army can leave. You get to keep all your weapons, your ammunitions, you keep your symbols of honor, all that stuff. He's like, and the people inside Bristol will be protected and they'll be looked after. He's like, if you accept the offer now, if you don't, this may get a bit more sticky and things may get a bit more gruesome. And Prince Rupert agrees to this, and he relinquishes control of Bristol, which was the other main port city for King Charles. And he rides out with his army and he goes to rejoin King Charles. And he goes and tells Charles, he's like, look, I've got your entire army. We've lost Bristol, which is obviously very bad for us, but I've got the army. And he's like, so this is good. We can rebuild for using this. And King Charles, in a letter to his nephew, says the immortal phrase, "You promised you could hold Bristol for 2 months, yet you couldn't hold it for 2 weeks." And then he ends the letter with, "I suggest you get on a boat to Europe and don't come back." And he exiles his nephew. About it. He later changes his mind after Rupert has to go and plead his case in person. But it kind of shows that, Sir Thomas Fairfax was good at getting people to agree to things about it, and King Charles was maybe not as compromising with it. But it means that there's been some studies and talks about it that suggest that Sir Thomas Fairfax alone shortened the Civil War by about a year because of all the garrisons that just gave up without having to face them, because they were like, New Model Army's very powerful. They've got a commander who's giving nice offers and will respect our wishes about it. Whereas at Chester, the military governor Byron was adamant to not accept peace offers from his counterpart, Sir William Brereton, because he was telling all the royalist gentry and all the royalist people, do not let that man in, because he will burn this city to the ground if we accept the offer. And with every offer, he'd be going around like, Brereton offers to look after the city. He lies. Don't believe him about it. Brereton actually had no interest in burning it down, but he didn't have the same reputation as Fairfax did, which means that it didn't matter if what Brereton's intentions were, just the fact that he wasn't as well known and he didn't have this good reputation meant that his royalist opponents could say whatever they wanted about him, and people would be more inclined to believe it.
Oh, blimey. Oh, yeah. That's actually really interesting. Like the fact that I suppose you need that, because I suppose it was still, like you said, it was still a confusing thing. Even at the end of the war, they were still doing the whole it's the king and parliament and stuff. So having a guy that's like, hey, I'm fighting this side, but I'm going to protect you guys. I suppose that's a good way. I suppose it's no wonder that people would kind of lean towards that. And I suppose for the civilian side of it, I think it's like, please just leave my hometown alone, sort of thing.
It's very much it. At the end of the day, if you're not as into the cause as some people might be, at the end of the day, all you want is for your homes to be protected from it. Chester didn't even want to get involved in the Civil War to begin with. They sat there and were like, but war's bad for business, guys. We don't want that. We like money, and we like having our houses standing. We don't want to be involved in a war. And so they agree to join the royalist cause eventually, because they get told basically there's no neutrality for them, as we've explained, an important location in the Civil War. They had to pick a side because they were poor. They had that road into Wales. There was no getting around it for them, and so the royalists go, join the royalist cause, and we'll promise to protect you from the parliamentarians if they try to attack. And then they say that any troops that are raised in Chester will only be used for the defence of Chester, not for the actual rest of the Civil War. And under those terms, Chester agreed. Those terms lasted for about 10 minutes until a royalist officer showed up and said, this garrison is now being taken to be added to the army going down to fight about the Battle of Edge Hill. You're all coming with me. And from that point on, it was like, well, some of the troops will be used to defend Chester, but others will be going afield.
Yeah, it fascinates me though. It's like if you got Fairfax, who is an honourable guy and you can actually trust his word, and then you've got these royalists, why would you join them? They're clearly lying.
Well, it's for a lot of it, it's that for the average person, they don't really get a say in this. When everyone shows like the maps of like the parliamentarian regions and the royalist regions, it's the nobility supporting regions rather than the actual people behind it. Most people, when we talk about the Civil War being a war between father and son, brother versus brother, friend against friend. It can all things like that. And there are cases where that happens. And the reason they usually happened was because you lived on one side of a river that had a parliamentarian supporting lord, and then your friend lives on the other side of the river who has a royalist supporting lord. And just like that, you're then being conscripted into their respective armies and being told to fight for those respective sides. And not many people had the actual ability to choose their own side in this civil war. They just sort of had to sit there and go, we'll wait for whichever one the Lord says we're fighting, I suppose.
Was the army itself given any actual proper military training?
They would be given training for it, specific, depending on those. So for muskets, they obviously need to know the loading and firing procedures about it, so that they can actually be used on the field. Otherwise, they're just a bunch of people with short sticks and not much else about them. So obviously they would be trained, and they would be given it was mostly rudimentary training about it, whether you're a pikeman, whether you're a musketeer. Cavalry would have more training, but they'd come from more sort of the more landed sides who had the ability, who had the horse riding backgrounds, so they already knew how to ride their horses around about it. But it was very varied. You had a lot of people who were it was just a case of, this is a motley crew of people I threw together and we're going to see how this goes, which is definitely what it was becoming for the royalists at the end of the war, where they were stripping garrisons off forts that thought they were never going to have to actually see any combat. So a lot of their troops were ill-trained and not very well prepared. King Charles was also ferrying in his troops from Ireland. These were English troops that had been fighting in Ireland for a long time. So they were very experienced and very used to fighting war. Fighting maybe a bit more brutal style of warfare than they were supposed to be fighting in England. So it's why Irish troops had a very notorious reputation. And the parliamentarians were able to whip this up as the barbarian Irish are coming over. They won't spare anyone. Even though a lot of those troops were actually English-born fighting in Ireland, but they were able to spin it as, they're Irish Catholics. They'll kill you all. They'll burn your homes. They're very aggressive. But they were used to a very almost brutalized style of fighting in Ireland. But you also had people who fought overseas as mercenaries before the Civil War, because while England's having its civil war, the whole of Europe's on fire at this point from the 30 Years' War that's raging across Europe, and that has tales of wholesale slaughter, cities being burned down. It's not a good time to be alive, turns out. Really not a good place to be, but it means that a lot of England never had an active role. They never joined a side, because being involved in a continental war is quite expensive, and they didn't really want to do that. So what they did do, what you'd have was individual volunteers going over and fighting for the side that they might actually have chosen, or the side that might have at least paid them to come over and fight. And so when the Civil War begins, they come back to fight in their armies, and they become the more experienced soldiers that could form the basis of some of the armies. England also had a militia system at this time, which mainly was existent in it was an Elizabethan system with the trained bands. In case that was created in case of Spanish invasion with the Spanish Armada, and they kept this going throughout the Stuart period. And it was local militias that would get together. So it was your local merchants and craftsmen would get together for a weekend, and they'd practice war and military tactics. And it was basically just a fun weekend for them. It was a bunch of lads going off for the weekend. To I'm off to military camp, dear. I'll be out for a weekend, and then they'd go off. And in most cases, I think they were just mucking about more than anything. But it meant that when the Civil War did begin, they'd sit there and go, well, we do have all these trained bands now across the country. And so if you were the lord that secured the city under your command, you also had command of the local trained band. And you'd go, congratulations, guys, you're now time for you to put that training to good use. So it was very varied. across it, but a lot of it was local militias. And then as the war dragged on, you had people who had more, they would be given more training, people were getting a bit more experience to it because they now had the exposure to war that had kind of been absent before in the years before it, where unless you lived near Scotland or lived in Ireland or went off to Europe, you would not have seen war or like experienced it. But by the end of it, they've been several years in, so people are now becoming more used to it, and that they would be putting more effort into things like training, getting the armies equipped and sorted out. I know that for like Oliver Cromwell, what does make him a very good cavalry commander was that he trained his cavalry to be a very disciplined force. When they face against Prince Rupert's horse at the Battle of Marston Moor, Prince Rupert describes them as the Ironsides because he says that no matter where you hit them, they don't break and run away like most parliamentarian horsemen do, because they're a trained, disciplined body. And what made them a very valuable tool in battles was because once they had finished fighting other cavalry, they wouldn't then just do the customary cavalry thing of running off to the hills to go loot the enemy baggage camp before the rest of the army could get to it so that you could get all the good stuff. They would actually stay on the field and turn and go help out other units. And it was things like that would help parliamentarian win some of its big battles, like the Battle of Marston Moor, the Battle of Naseby. Those battles can often be attributed by the fact that their units were just being told to stop running off.
Oh. So the battle that you're focusing on today, I'm going to make it a sandwich. What was the war before it, and the battle before it, and what was the battle after it?
The battle before it would be the Battle of Naseby. In terms of like for King Charles, it's where he lost his main army at Oxford. It was also where he would lose like lots of his men, and so all he had was a small force of about 3,000 cavalry that he was hoping to rebuild into a full fighting force. Again, that could at least threaten Parliament about it. And so he goes and he fights the battle and to try and relieve Chester and take their garrison, so he can add it to his ranks, so he could keep that road to North Wales open, so he could take those garrisons, to keep the port open so that he could take troops from Ireland and supplies, and then to try and go up to Scotland where he could link up with the Scottish. The battle that comes after it is for Charles in particular, it would be the Battle of Sherburn in Elmet, which was fought just a month later. And it's another one where it's not a very big battle, but it's one that basically built on the defeat of Charles at Rowton Heath, where at the Battle of Rowton Heath, his plan to relieve Chester fails spectacularly in some cases. He loses a big part of his army, which is obviously not good. For some casualty estimates say he lost about 600. He has 600 dead and about 900 injured, which is not very good when that's about a third of your army gone, or almost like half your army gone, really. And then the Battle of Sherburn and Elmet was just the parliamentarians finishing off the last bits of it. So he then went from having some semblance of a force to no semblance of a force. And it was very much then him trying to strip things together. And so to, I guess, put it in some context, the Battle of Rowton Heath is in September 1645. The Battle of Sherburn and Elmet is in October 1645, and Charles surrenders in January 1646. About it, he does not have much afterwards. He can't rebuild a force in England. He's lost his main network to Wales, which is now getting overrun to Parliament. Chester falls at the end of February 1646. So he loses his connection to Ireland, and his main ally in Scotland marches down into England to try and help him in September, like late September, early October, and he's also defeated. So he loses his main Scottish ally. So it becomes a bunch of dominoes afterwards. where they often say Naseby's the beginning of the domino chain for the end of the Civil War. Rowton Heath is very much where it becomes the dominoes can't get stopped. Because he's now, at this point, he's got nothing to really continue with.
Yeah. And then ultimately we get the ending that we know of, which is he goes to get his head lobbed off, basically, and apparently what was it, something like he wore 2 shirts to make sure he didn't shiver or something like that?
Apparently it's a very cold day when he got executed. So yeah, he wore 2 shirts so that he would at least not be shivering, because he didn't want people to think he was afraid of dying. That he wanted to go out with the grace and dignity of a king about it. And he didn't want, all the spectators to be looking, going, look at him, he's shivering, he's fearful. He just wanted them all to stand there and go, what actually happens when you kill a king? We've never seen this before. What actually happens? Does lightning?
The world opens up.
Some of them thought it was going to. It was quite a popular event because people were just curious at that point to see just lightning come down when you kill a king. Just God disapprove or anything, and then it happened, and they all sat there and went, "Oh, okay, I guess it's just normal."
Just another guy, just a fancy guy.
Just another guy that goes.
So, as you were saying throughout that, Oliver Cromwell was just a little tiny person, not that important, aside from when he did his army, being able to be in charge of his army and have it all organised. What made him then suddenly become the figurehead of the Civil War?
So following the passing of the self-denying ordinance, Cromwell may not be the head military figure, but he does become a leading political figure. About this, he's already got a big reputation for his prowess on the battlefield, his skill in organizing. He plays a big role in actually organizing the new model army and bringing it all together, and then for Sir Thomas Fairfax to lead it effectively, with him serving as the head of the cavalry for it. And his rise to fame really takes place in the Second Civil War, where Sir Thomas Fairfax is still leading the new model army, but Cromwell's got greater power. He's able to lead the armies in his own right as well, leading the large detachments to run around the country and fight all these disparate elements of the royalists, the Scottish coming down because they'd swap sides. You had royalist uprising across the country. It was like them having to go around and swat a bunch of flies all very quickly. So Cromwell was given a lot of autonomy to go around and do it. But I think the real turning point comes after the Civil War, that second one, and they come back to that conversation about what do you do about the king? What do we do about things like that? And Cromwell was becoming increasingly about we should get rid of the king. Eventually he goes, we have to kill the king, really. We can't just let him stay around, because he's clearly proving to be not just impossible to negotiate with, but actively working against us. And in many ways, you could argue he was being a traitor to the English people. And Fairfax sort of looks at that and goes, I'm not really about killing the king. He's a political moderate about this. He was very much, he wasn't an MP. About this, he was more in this to support the parliamentarian cause, but he wasn't about killing the king, removing the monarchy, and having the parliamentarian dominance that was starting to become increasingly advocated for. So he was sort of stood there I'm not about this, guys. I'm gonna head out, and he resigns from the new model army, and as a result, then Oliver Cromwell then rises to be the head of the army, and he's able to orchestrate an almost military-esque coup of Parliament in what is called Pride's Purge, where they were having the vote on what to do about the king. It's the great vote to decide whether they're getting rid of him or not. And Cromwell gets a colonel, I think he's Colonel Pride, to stand outside the House of Commons with a list of people that are not allowed in the building. And so whenever an MP shows up wanting to gain entry to have a say in the vote, Pride is there to either detain them if they resist or turn them away if they'll happily turn away, and basically coerce it. So when you look at like the actual vote to kill the king, it's like, yes, like 80 MPs voted in favor of it, or I can't remember the number, but it's like a massive majority voted in favor of killing the king. And then you look at like who actually attended, and it's not actually that many for it. It's, I think, only about a third of Parliament were present for the vote. And the rest were deemed to be too moderate or royalist sympathizing, so they get turned away from it. And so that he's able to, that's how they get the king killed. They talk about what's happening after, and Cromwell, using his status, is effectively seen as the obvious choice as the person to lead not only the army but now the government for it. And that's how he gets that rise to fame. And that rise to power. When Cromwell dies, his son Richard Cromwell takes over as he's the appointed successor of the Lord Protectorate, but he doesn't have that same prowess that his dad did. He doesn't have that military experience that his dad did. He doesn't have the army loyalty, and he doesn't have the loyalty amongst lots of the other parliamentarians. So everyone just sort of starts ignoring him, and eventually the restoration course takes off, because it seems to be the only course and the only faction that can actually get some steam going by saying, look, you've got a weak leader, no one's listening to him, but you know who we could listen to? We could listen to that King Charles II, or that Charles boy that we could bring over for it. And when he comes over, Sir Thomas Fairfax re-emerges from the woodwork and openly endorses the return of the monarchy for it, which again gives them a massive boost to their the restoration campaign, because now they have once again a figure that people respected coming back out and going, guys, I think we may have took it a bit too far. Let's bring this back to what this was meant to be, and we'll restore the monarchy, and we'll try and bring some semblance of normality back to people.
Yeah. Oh, this has been. It's really interesting. I want to talk to you more, but we're coming to like an hour now.
I know. So I was like, God, yeah, we're covering a lot, aren't we?
we are covering a lot, but it is really interesting. And is there anything else you want to say before we sign this off?
Just that, it's been a pleasure being a part of this. Thank you much for having me on. I've very much enjoyed this. I'd gladly come on again if people are not sick to death of hearing about the Civil War at this point. About this, I can't wait for all the reviews coming through going, please, never him again, please. We can't take anymore. But I would gladly come on and talk about it again if people were up for it. I guess I should shout out the things. So I can, if it's all right, I shout out the things I do. I have my own social media account, JammyHistory, which I share like my reenactment stuff on, my Civil War stuff on, all that good stuff. I have a little podcast where I occasionally come out the woodwork to make an episode for about it, which includes some very wacky tales, wacky things about this. I'll sprinkle in like a teaser of one, which was the first episode I did on Oliver Cromwell's brother-in-law who believed in aliens, and I won't say any more than that. All I will say is, imagine the dinner tables, the Christmas dinner tables they had between Oliver Cromwell and his alien loving brother-in-law. I always joke saying that it's why Cromwell banned Christmas, was so he never had to see him again at the dinners. Was like with the idea.
That's legit. Yeah. That's proper legit. I think that's what happened.
I think so. I'm on board with it. But it's good stuff. And then, of course, the reenactment group that I'm part of, I also help out a lot with their social media page. It's the Earl of Manchester's Regiment of Foot. We have the website. We have all the social media pages. We do daily English Civil War snippets, talking about all different aspects, not just things to do with the Earl of Manchester, just the whole Civil War in general. And we try and cover a lot, as much as we can, me and the guys who run it. So check those social media pages out. And if you want to have a go at reenactment and come along, get stuck in. we're always up for new members. It's a very easy thing to hop into. About it, you can get a temp membership. We'll get you all kitted up for a weekend. You get thrown straight into the thick of a battle about it with very little training. So I guess you will have the real experience in some cases. And it's just good fun. You get to travel we always say travel the country, you meet interesting people, and then you hit them. And that's our slogan. And it is a good thing to do. So that's all my shout outs from it. But check all of it out.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll link that all down below for people to be able to find, especially your first episode. I definitely need to hunt that episode out now. I need to go and listen to that. So yeah, thank you, Jamie, for coming on to this podcast. I've really enjoyed it. I'm actually surprised at the level of Civil War knowledge I actually have, but you've obviously enhanced that. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.